All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to see you all here. Welcome to our discussion today with Frederick Lawrence, who's going to be speaking on the topic of free speech in challenging times. I recognize quite a few of you out there, but for those who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I'm Frank Doyle, the provost here and professor of engineering and neuroscience. I guess I can say no longer new, right, Chris? I've been here a year and 2 months, so no longer new. In my short time here at the academic helm, the topic of academic freedom has really been at the forefront. And my colleagues here would agree over the past year. But one of the things I really enjoy most about our family here at Brown is the fact that they're so willing to engage in conversation, not only across the divide of topics, but across the spectrum of viewpoints, from students to faculty, staff, administration. Everybody feels comfortable getting involved in that. And I think that's an important part of the topic we're going to speak about today, academic freedom. I'll say that it ensures that scholars can pursue knowledge wherever it may lead them, and that's an important part of this premise, without fear of censorship, retaliation, or undue interference. That freedom empowers our faculty to be able to teach, conduct research on topics, challenge conventional wisdom, challenge and question deeply held beliefs, and maybe spark critical conversations. Gives our students the ability to explore ideas, even when those ideas are uncomfortable or potentially controversial. Our role as a university is not to shield individuals from ideas, but to equip them with the skills to engage and thoughtfully, critically analyze these ideas. We want an environment where diverse perspectives can be shared, debated, where diverse perspectives are buttressed by intellectual rigor, innovation, and growth. And that really is the other part of the calculus here, that with the freedom comes responsibility. Not to sound like a Marvel comic here, but that responsibility is the commitment to academic integrity, to be exercised with respect to truth, evidence, and ethical standards is a critical part of exercising that freedom. So I want to commend the members of the Brown community, many of you here today, who have upheld these values throughout the continued discourse we've had over the course of the past year or so. Whether in the classroom, the laboratory, public discourse, we'll continue to stand by our faculty, our students, our staff in defending their rights to explore, to debate, and to pursue knowledge without fear. So now it's my great honor to introduce our visitor today, our speaker today, who will explore this topic in great depth. So Frederick M. Lawrence is the 10th Secretary and CEO of the Phi Beta Kappa Society, the nation's first and most prestigious honor society, founded in 1776. About to come up on a big birthday. Frederick is a distinguished lecturer at the Georgetown Law Center and has previously served as president of Brandeis University, dean of the George Washington University Law School, and visiting professor and senior research scholar at the Yale Law School. An accomplished scholar, teacher, and attorney, Frederick is one of the nation's leading experts on civil rights, free expression, and bias crimes. He has widely published and lectured internationally. He's the author of a book entitled Punishing Hate, Bias Crimes Under American Law, which examines bias-motivated violence and the laws governing how such violence is punished in the United States. Frederick has testified before Congress concerning free expression on campus and on federal hate crime legislation, was the keynote speaker at the meeting of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe on the topic of bias-motivated violence, was a senior research fellow at University College London, and the recipient of a Ford Foundation grant to study bias-motivated violence in the United Kingdom. As president of Brandeis, Frederick strengthened ties between the university and its alumni, and focused on sustaining the university's historical commitment to educational access through financial aid. An acclaimed teacher, Frederick taught an undergraduate seminar on punishment and crime. It was one of the most popular undergraduate courses offered at Brandeis. His legal career was distinguished by service as an assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York in the 1980s, where he became chief of the Civil Rights Unit. He received a bachelor's degree in 1977 from Williams College, magna cum laude, where he was elected to Phi Beta Kappa, and a law degree in 1980 from Yale Law School, where he was an editor of the Yale Law Journal. Following his presentation this afternoon, I'll moderate a discussion, and I'll invite all of you to think about questions over the course of his presentation and invite you to come up to the mics at the end and offer those questions so we can have a facilitated conversation. So please join me in welcoming Frederick Lawrence.
Thank you, Frank. As I heard that introduction, I realized the whole talk, we could just drop footnotes from that introduction. First of all, your description of the treatment of academic freedom on this campus, for which it is renowned, not only is an important thing for us to talk about, but also the difference between academic freedom and free expression, which we'll come back to. There's a mistaken notion that academic freedom is the sort of special free expression rights that academics get. But in fact, I said to my colleague and dear friend, Robert Post, former dean of the Yale Law School, who'll come up a little bit later in the talk as well for some of his work, that when I teach these subjects, I always say free expression and academic freedom are not identical twins. They're more like cousins. And Post arched an eyebrow and said, distant cousins. So we'll talk about why in fact, free expression and academic freedom are really measured along different axes. And they really are related, but are talking about very, very different things. You mentioned Williams College, and I'm delighted that in attendance today is a classmate I have not seen in, well, since we were both a little bit younger, Marty. Coming up on 50 years, exactly right. So it's wonderful to see you again. At Phi Beta Kappa, my board chair, what we call the president of the Phi Beta Kappa Society, is a member of this faculty, Esther Jones. Esther, thank you for being here. And your president and I go back to when I've been at Brandeis for a while, and I think you had just about begun here at Brown, and we met at an AAU president's meeting. There's a special bond, brotherhood and sisterhood among presidents who know what it feels like to be there. And you are very fortunate that you have the president you do. And she has a very big job that she has to do, and you have a job too. And your job is to help her be successful. So let's talk a little bit about what I call free speech in challenging times. To say the least, this is a title that needs no explication for the time in which we've been living. The events, particularly of last semester, last academic year, were for the most in half a century or more, a time of protest on campus, of turmoil on campus, which has led to the need, the opportunity, the obligation to confront questions of what do we do with difficult conversations, and not just difficult conversations of the kind where everybody's sitting down and chatting together, but the difficult conversations where people are, let's say, temperature is rising, hot to the touch. What do we do in those kinds of circumstances? I think it's fair to say that as schools have responded, and I'm talking globally now, not just this campus, but schools across the country, there are two big takeaways from last spring. And I think one, as we look at the events of this fall, schools have gotten largely right. And I think the other one, it's fair to say that a little more work and a little more focus is necessary. So let me touch that first base, and then we're going to spend our time on that second factor. Touching that first base, one of the things that I think we all saw played out in real time last spring was a lack of clarity in the rules governing expression on many of our campuses. Either a lack of clarity as to what was and was not permissible, or where it was permissible and not, and also questions about were rules being enforced in a fair way, in a consistent way. So one thing that you have seen all over the country this fall is schools have been really focused on articulating sets of rules, sometimes with a specificity that makes your head spin. You can chalk up to this line, but not that line. I mean, if this weren't so serious, it would almost be comic. It's not comic because it's very serious. But this idea of trying to articulate, this is a space where this can take place, and this is a space where that can take place, and here's what happens if you violate these rules. Now, there's a virtue to this level of clarity. You avoid some of what took place last spring of people who didn't know what was going to happen if they did certain things. So I'm certainly not going to critique explication and clarity with respect to rules. It would not sit in the mouth of a lawyer and law professor not to be one who embraces clarity of laws and of rules. It's just that it's starting in the wrong place. And this is the second piece. The second piece is that we don't start by talking about rules and punishment. That's what happens if something has gone wrong. The function of interstate highways is not to give people speeding tickets when they break the speed limit. We have to do that from time to time, but that's not the purpose of the interstate system. What is the purpose of the interstate system? Well, that one's pretty straightforward. What is the purpose of the university? That turns out to be a little more complicated. So that's what I want to spend some time on when we think about how do we respond constructively to the challenges that are happening on our campus. The first order of business is to refract these questions through the lens of what is the goal, what is the mission of the university, what is it we're trying to achieve? So think of it this way. Long before Harvard Business School was doing workshops on strategic planning, one of the masters of strategic planning was Dwight Eisenhower before he was president, when he was commander-in-chief of the Allied forces in Europe. Eisenhower kept on his desk a little card in which he had mission, strategy, tactics. Tactics were all the different ways they were implementing the big strategic movements that were taking place in Europe, the theater that he was involved in. But at the very top was the mission. What do you suppose he wrote at the top of that card? I'll give you a hint. It's 3 words. Win the war. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? But Eisenhower said he got amazing clarity of vision on difficult decisions he had to make by refracting it through the lens of how is this or is this not helping us win the war? Okay, so what's our version of win the war? I have to tell you, I've done this setup of this talk, particularly at Board of Trustees retreats. One person in the room, who shall go nameless, it will particularly appreciate this. And at this moment, I always say to the board members, what is the mission of this university? Madam President, you know what they do? They do exactly what first-year law students do the first time you ask a Socratic question. They break eye contact because they don't want to get called on. Right? They forget what law professors know, which is that, as the great philosopher Joe Lewis said, they can run, but they can't hide. I can move around the room. So what is the mission of the university? Well, I happen to know what the mission of your university is. It looks something like that. Let's fit this one into the context of mission statements generally around the country while you sort of refamiliarize yourself with the mission of Brown University, the mission statement of Brown University. Most mission statements say some version of creation, discovery, and transmission of knowledge, sometimes for the betterment of society, betterment of the world. Sometimes it's training leaders for the future. My personal favorite is enter to learn, leave to serve. Anybody happen to know where enter to learn, leave to serve is the mission statement? That would be Aligarh Muslim University in Delhi, outside of Delhi, a preeminent Muslim university in South Asia. The foundation of the Aligarh movement, which gave rise to, once there was a decision that violent revolution against the British in South Asia was not going to work, they were going to try something different, and Aligarh played a major role in that. Okay, so what do we glean from your mission statement now that you've had a chance to refamiliarize yourself and reread it? Let's look at a couple of things in particular. Discovering, communicating, preserving knowledge and understanding in a spirit of free inquiry. You can't achieve that mission without a robust system of free inquiry, of free expression, of the ability to ask questions not sure where they're coming out. Just what your provost said before about the open-ended side of academic freedom. The judge for whom I was privileged to clerk Amalia Kearse on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. I remember writing a draft opinion for her one time that I just worked on so hard, and I was very proud of it. And she called me into her side of chambers, and she said, "This is really, really good work, Fred, really thoughtful, really smart," and I'm getting pumped up, right? And she said, "And we're not going to use a word of it." And she watched my face fall, and she said, no, don't feel bad. And she said something I never forgot and applied to my own work in the years subsequent. She said, "I thought this was the right way to analyze this case, and I didn't know that it wasn't going to work until I saw," here's the phrase, "it didn't write that way." Right? Many of us in the room have that experience of trying out an idea. Sometimes it's the first time as a student you ask a question, and in the middle of asking it, you see where it's come off the rails. But you wouldn't have known that if you didn't have the courage to ask. And for some of us, it's a full draft, and it's a judge or ultimately yourself saying, "Doesn't write that way. I didn't know it didn't write that way." But you have to have the freedom to run that all the way through in order to achieve that mission of discovering, communicating, preserving knowledge, and understanding in a spirit of free inquiry. What about that unified community piece? That one's a little more complicated. I'm going to come back to that later on. You can hold me to that. So if we glean from our mission statement that a deep commitment not only to academic freedom, and here let me pause on the difference between what I mean by academic freedom on the one hand, free expression on the other, but also a commitment to free expression. Right? Academic freedom is measured along the axis of competence. Free expression is measured along the axis of the right of us to express ourselves. Where does our right come from free expression? Right? Academic freedom comes from the academic business. There are certain rules in each discipline, and they're pretty wide. There are different ways of attacking different problems, but there are some that are out of bounds. So when we talk about free speech on campus, that's a very funny term to use, isn't it? In my class, I teach still, Georgetown Law School. I teach classes in higher education law and free expression on campus. And because of my misspent youth as an assistant U.S. attorney, I teach a section of criminal procedure in the fall this semester. So in a class on criminal procedure, if a student were to raise their hand and say, "I'd like to talk about biochemistry today," I'd say, "No, we're not going to do that." There's no free expression to that extent. I'm setting up the guardrails of what we will and won't talk about. And any of us who've taught know the experience, particularly in a large class, that when you ask a question and then you get an answer that is not exactly what you were expecting, you get a split second to decide, is this off the mark in a way that I'd best try to hone it back in? Or is this off the mark in a really interesting way that let's go with that? You don't get long to make that decision. And you don't get them all right. But you do try to cabin in certain parts of the conversation because there are certain parts that are relevant to what you're doing, certain parts that are not relevant. Can you make decisions based on the content of expression and academic freedom? Of course you can. We do it all the time. It's called grading. Of course you can. We do it all the time. It's called hiring new faculty. And of course you can. We do it all the time. It's called whether you tenure somebody or promote somebody or not. We're making value judgments all the time within the realm of academic freedom, because we are putting it on the axis of competence measured by the standards of the academic profession, as opposed to free expression. Where does the right of free expression come from? I would suggest there are three different places it might come from. One, we could associate in classical sources with Aristotle, more recently in the 20th century with someone like Louis Brandeis. The thought that who we are as human beings is our ability to express ourselves. We are, after all, a storytelling species. That's what distinguishes us from the other mammals. I know, the thumb too. The thumb's good. Storytelling is better. Right? That's how we communicate. That's how we have done the things that have allowed us to evolve, good and ill, over the last couple 100,000 years as an experiment, as Homo sapiens, that we are a storytelling species. Our participation in the human project requires us to express ourselves in that Aristotelian sense. A more outcome-oriented or consequentialist argument we would associate with someone like Oliver Wendell Holmes, or earlier John Milton in his celebrated essay, Areopagitica, which many say is the first essay, first document to talk about free expression theory. It's the first sort of civil liberties document. But in both cases, it's an argument that says, it's familiar to you with the expression of the marketplace of ideas. That the reason you need free expression is to try out different ideas. The best idea will win. Obviously, this lines up with neoclassical economics. I think there are many critiques that might be raised with that as to whether or not we, in fact, have free speech that gets to the better result in the way that Holmes talked about the marketplace of ideas, or the way that Milton talked about whoever knew truth to lose to falsity in the field of combat. Milton did not know about social media, unfortunately. So the combat between truth and falsity is a little more complicated. But that's another kind of justification for free expression. And finally, Robert Post, who I mentioned earlier, has written about the free speech role that it plays in democratic legitimization. The whole idea of a democratic society requires the ability for people to express themselves, to express dissent, and as opposed to academic freedom, this one is not being measured on the realm of truth and falsity. This is being measured on a different realm that will be limited very differently. And that is a realm that says it is the nature of who we are, it is the nature of our social project, it is the way in which we legitimize our democracies, and maybe in some way it is still that Holmesian project, that Miltonian project of trying to seek truth through this combat of truth and other kinds of truth, and yes, falsity, to reach a better result. I would argue that your mission to be accomplished obviously requires academic freedom. That's sort of the easy piece. But I think it requires free expression too. I think it requires the ability of all of us to try out different ideas, the good ones, the bad ones, and yes, the just plain stupid ones. And I'm not using stupid in a trivial way at all. I mean, think of the following example, which I think makes the point. If I say that the moon is made of green cheese, I think that you would think it's time to walk out of the lecture hall. But on the other hand, if the government said that they're going to punish me for doing that, I think you'd probably be pretty upset with that. On the other hand, if an astronomy professor said the moon is made of green cheese, you'd say, well, I really hope that person doesn't get renewed, or certainly doesn't get tenure, doesn't get promoted, because that doesn't meet the standards of the profession. I'm choosing a silly example for a reason, to make the point that that which is protected by free expression would not be protected by academic freedom. They are two different models. Free expression, in most cases, is the broader. Come back next year, we'll do the more technical lecture on academic freedom and free expression, and I'll demonstrate how actually each one is broader than the other, depending on what the context is. But for most purposes, we would say that it is the broader, and applies to all people, obviously, and measured against this right of expression. So, first articulating our first principle that's going to help us think about what are the rules that ought to apply on campus, rather than starting with the rules themselves, but working from what the mission of the institution is, articulating the mission so that the rules are built out of the mission, not the other way around. Put somewhat differently, one of the mistakes that has happened in public conversation on this, and I'm always careful how I do this publicly, and of course this is being recorded. Somebody said earlier, do I know, at a certain point, this is the hot mic. Any former university president knows the best best rule for handling these things, just assume you're always on a hot mic. It's less to remember, right? So just don't say anything you don't want repeated, but here goes. This is not something I would not want to say publicly. It's that it's easy to soundbite in the wrong way. So stay with me and you'll see how it comes out. What's been going on for the past months, the past year, has often been portrayed as a battle between free expression on the one hand and safety on the other. Two prime values of the university: keep people safe and free inquiry, free expression. I hope I persuaded you, and you didn't take much persuading, that free inquiry, free expression is the hallmark, the first principle we're going to start with. But at the same time, as a trustee at a university where I spoke said, safety is our North Star. And I thought, boy, that is really a powerful statement, and that is really wrong in a really interesting but important way. Of course safety is important. The difference when we talk about, and you see how you can get caught on this, My most recent time testifying before Congress, your provost said I testified before Congress. My most recent time is, yes, I was one of those people who testified before the House Education Committee last spring. We can talk about during the Q&A if you like. But the lawyers who prepared me, and they did a good job, no fault, no pregnant negatives. I'm just saying they did a very good job preparing me. But when I said the difference is they are confusing the fundamental with the instrumental. Universities exist for the purpose of creating knowledge. They don't exist for the purpose of being safe. And my lawyer stopped me and said, that soundbite is going to kill you. Why don't you stop saying that? Because you're going to get quoted as saying, Lauren said universities don't have to be safe. I said, that's not what I meant. She said, I know that's not what you meant. But that's not what it's going to sound like right there. So I hope the people who are listening stay with me through the rest of it, which is to say, of course, safety is important, but it's a category error. It's misunderstanding the difference between the fundamental and the instrumental. Fundamentally, universities are about, that's the first principle, free expression, free inquiry, and academic freedom. Fundamentally. And instrumentally, they have to be safe in order to support that. That is an important goal, but it tells us something about ordering, and it tells us something how we think about safety concerns. It's not that they aren't in tension, it's that calling them the same thing, the two great models of the university, is misunderstanding what we're about. So, first principle is a presumption of free expression. That is to say, when we are not sure whether something is protected or not protected, we don't start in a neutral position. We don't sort of weigh out how smart was it to say, how unsmart was it to say. We start with a presumption in favor of protecting expression. That is the wall that we have to establish that we think will give us the greatest support for the execution of our mission. And of course, if that's all it were, then this talk would have been called Free Speech in Challenging Times. It's not as hard as it looks. But that's not what the talk is called, because that's not where it ends. Right? The next question is, if that's our first principle, a presumption of free expression, so where are the limits on that free expression? How do we think about what those limits ought to be? Bear with me while I go down a blind alley with you just a little bit, because I want to take you down how the Supreme Court, for example, has often thought about this issue of what's protected and what's not protected. And it's very tempting because it promises a kind of clarity that it actually can't deliver. That is the so-called distinction between speech and conduct. Speech, expression is protected, conduct is not. And you hear aphorisms like, my right to express myself and swing my arm ends where your face shows up, right? That's conduct. When I'm talking about it, that's speech. This is conduct. And conduct can be regulated, speech can't. This occurred in the work that I did earlier that your provost mentioned in his kind introduction in terms of hate crimes, and the Supreme Court actually upheld a hate crime statute precisely on this grounds. The difference between being a legal scholar and a lawyer, the legal scholar in me criticized that opinion for being fundamentally flawed in its execution and how it was reasoned. The lawyer in me was happy to be one of the people, because I worked on that case, who took our win and stepped away from the table, right? Don't count your money at the table was not created for poker players. It was created by lawyers involved in constitutional litigation. So you take your win and you move on. But fundamentally, speech and conduct is not going to give you a distinction that's particularly worthwhile. Let's take a couple of examples. If just about now, one of you figured you'd really have heard enough. So you stood right there with a sign that said, Lawrence is full of cold tea. Is that speech or is that conduct? Of course, the answer is it's both, right? It's expressive behavior. And it's kind of foolish to try to cabin it into one category or another. And yet the court tried to do that. You all know that you can have a constitutional right to burn an American flag, right? And every time the court has held that, it feels obliged to say, the position I share, I will add, that there's something important about burning an American flag. Nonetheless, you have the right to do that, okay? Why do you have the right to do that according to these cases? Altogether now, because that's expression, not conduct, all right? So far, so good? Now, here is another example. It's a case that's particularly relevant to, looking around the room, maybe about a third or less of the room, that is to say, people of my gender and my age or older. That is, it's a case that involved burning draft cards. People my age and older, men my age and older can all tell you what our draft number was in the lottery. Mine was 85. That was pretty scary. but it was just late enough, as my classmates know, that we were on the other side of the divide, so we weren't likely to get drafted. Why couldn't you burn a draft card? Congress thought that that was illegal for a number of reasons, not the least of which young men were required to have their draft card at all times. So if you burnt a draft card, by definition, you didn't have your draft card. So that is challenged, case called O'Brien against the United States. And how should O'Brien come out? The court upholds the law that says you can't burn a draft card. Why? By now you should see where we're going. Oh, well, because that's conduct, not speech. Burning a draft card is conduct, burning a flag is speech. That is a distinction that only a lawyer could appreciate, and I'm a lawyer who doesn't appreciate it. Most scholars obviously tore these apart, and a very famous law review article written by John Hart Ely, a constitutional law scholar, talked about why ultimately the best way to think about both of these cases is that it is 100% speech, 100% conduct, inextricably intertwined. The problem we put this back on campus is that if you have a distinction that you have essentially assumed your own conclusions, that which you wish to regulate, you will call conduct. That which you wish to protect, you will call speech. That's bad enough when it's happening in society. Try telling your student affairs people that's what they ought to do on campus. Try telling your students your speech is protected, but your conduct is not, but we can't really distinguish it for you. You can't make distinctions based on this. So what could you base it on? I would suggest you do what we do in the criminal law all the time. You focus on people's intent, their state of mind. Not always so easy to tell, sometimes surprisingly easy to tell. It is exactly what distinguishes murder from manslaughter, from criminally negligent homicide, to no crime at all. If I were to tell you, for example, that somebody took a bat and hit somebody else in the head very hard, causing major injury, and then I were to ask you what crime has that person committed, my guess is some of you would say assault, some would say assault with a deadly weapon, some might even say attempted murder, until somebody said, properly, you haven't given us enough facts. Because now I will add two other key facts. The swinger of the bat, the perpetrator, was standing like this. And the victim of said conduct was standing like this. It's an accident. What have I changed? I haven't changed the wound. I haven't changed the injury. Well, I have changed the injury, haven't I? Holmes famously said, even a dog knows the difference between being tripped over and being kicked. The harm actually has something to do, I know, it's a terrible expression, right? And I love dogs. And every time I do this, I think to myself, I've got to find a better quote for that point. And somebody always reacts the way you did. So I just want you to know I feel your pain. And just for a second, I'm going to think about not using that quote anymore, but I got to tell you, it's not going to last. I'm going to use it next time. Okay. So your injury actually is related to the state of mind of the actor. It's the difference between an accident and an on purpose. Somebody hits you by accident. If the person says, I'm sorry, it's pretty much over. But if somebody hits you on purpose, that might take a lot more, and you might never forgive the person for doing that. So what we would want to know is, what did the actor have in mind? Where the purpose of the behavior is to communicate, then it will kick back into that presumption of protection. But where the purpose is to threaten, to intimidate, or unduly to disrupt the operations of the university, then you will rebut the presumption of free expression, which is to say, our boundary tells us that we started with the presumption of free expression, but it's not an irrebuttable presumption. Behavior that is intended to intimidate, threaten violence, unduly disrupt the operations of the university will not be protected. Are these going to be bright lines all the time? Of course not. I'm much more confident that I have the right questions to ask than I am that I've got the right answers to those questions. But asking the right questions is a good place to start, and it does tell us where we can begin to think about these situations. It would explain why standing out in front of a lecture and yelling and screaming that people shouldn't come into it is protected. Blocking people from coming in is not. Telling people you disagree with them strongly is. Threatening people is not. And there are going to be close calls. But at least we know the piece that we're having this discussion in, and it shows how safety as an instrumental value is not driving the process. The purpose of our universities is not to punish students, God forbid. The purpose of our universities is to educate our students. It is to educate all of us. It is to create knowledge. It is to disseminate knowledge. So for the Hegelians in the crowd, you may feel as if you've sort of seen a thesis and an antithesis, and you're wondering, so where's the synthesis piece coming? Because this is not all there is either. The third principle, I would argue, we presume speech, we set the boundaries at the margins for intentional threatening behavior, threatening of violence, and disrupting the university. But going back to our underlying principle, surely there is more to be said than you have a right to speak. Surely there is something to be said about what is the nature of speech that we think at our highest level we are trying to cause our students to think about. What is the way in which we think we ought to communicate? This has been a factor in a number of different ways over the past decade. Talking about these issues 10 years ago, it was the same issues, some of the same slides, very different context. That was the context of things like white supremacists who wished to speak on campus. People tended to be on opposite sides with respect to those who wanted to protect that and those who wanted to repress that. Some of us were arguing that had to be protected because 10 years later there might be other kind of speech that would have to be protected, the time in which we're living now. So part of the moral obligation to speak is about the way to rebut, for example, the Richard Spencers of the world who wanted to speak on college campuses. One answer was to shut them down. Another was an obligation of members of the campus community to speak out broadly. The way, for example, the president at University of Florida, this is several presidents ago, actually he's back as the university president there now, that's right. If you wait long enough, the same person can come back. Who famously said Spencer can speak on our campus, but what he is likely to say, based on everything he said in the past, is antithetical to the values of this university. So that's sort of the major normative piece of this. But then never forget the role of humor at all times. The least likely time the humor is going to play the role is the most important time to think about it. There was a pub in Gainesville that sold free pitchers of beer to anyone who turned in unused tickets to the Richard Spencer event. It turns out there's a First Amendment right to speak. There's no First Amendment right to have anybody show up and listen to you. So all of that in those days was about the obligation to speak out, to criticize people like Richard Spencer. We're living in a very different climate right now in terms of where a lot of these conflicts are coming from, and to paint with a very broad brush, 10 years ago, it tended to be very much us and them coming to our campus, and they had to be confronted on behalf of us. Now it feels like it's only us every place we look. Right? Members of the community are very much at different positions, fiercely held, intensely held on issues. So for all of these purposes, those and now, I would articulate what I call the 3 rules of vigorous civility. I understand vigorous civility sounds like an oxymoron, and of course I mean it to sound like an oxymoron, but it's not. I think civility has gotten a bad rap lately. Civility is suggested either that it's about silencing speech in the interest of some kind of civil dialogue, whatever, that civil meaning contentless dialogue, not vigorous civility. Vigorous civility is serious, real conversation. Nor is there anything uncivil about a vigorous discussion. I mean, as I'm giving this speech, I could insult you. I could say nasty things about you. I could make fun of you. Why would I do that? I have a constitutional right to do that. Why is that a right I would want to exercise? Hopefully I learned somewhere along the line not to behave that way. And if I didn't learn that, then there's never too late for the community to play some role in helping me learn that. So the 3 rules of vigorous civility quickly. One, that we must learn to disagree without delegitimizing the other. Paradoxically, disagreement is community building, not community destroying. If I disagree with you, it means I've heard your position, and I hope you've heard mine. And now we're talking about our disagreement in that. That is actually community building. It does make us wonder what that unified community is all about. I told you I'd come back to that. But delegitimizing is different. Delegitimizing is not where I say, I've heard you and I disagree with you. Delegitimizing says you have no place at the table. You don't belong here. You're not part of this community. That's what it means to delegitimize. So vigorous civility says we disagree without delegitimizing. Second, we at least begin by challenging each other's ideas, not challenging each other's motives. It is very easy to challenge other people's motives. It's sort of a shorthand for a dialogue. I know why you're saying that. It's because of such and such. Then I don't have to deal with your ideas. I just am dealing with your motives. I say at least initially, because let's not be naive here. Some of what we're dealing with today, going back to my recent experience in Congress, for example, are people who do not mean higher education well. And I don't mind that that's on the video that's being captured. There are many people who don't mean higher education well. We should question their motives. But don't start a difficult conversation, particularly not within the campus community, by questioning people's motives. Very, very rarely, very, very, very rarely does anybody wake up in the morning and say, today's the day I get to screw up the university. That's not what people here are doing. They're disagreeing about things that they really care about. And they have to disagree without delegitimizing, and they have to challenge each other's ideas, not each other's motives. Finally, the third, which I know sounds like the simplest and the thinnest, but it is in fact the hardest and the thickest, and that is the search for common ground. Let me talk about what I mean by the search for common ground. It doesn't mean taking the levels of conversation to such a high level of abstraction that of course we agree. It makes me furious that in major debates, particularly presidential debates, when the candidates are asked, can you say anything positive about each other? They immediately go outside of the merits. I'm sure she's a good mother. I'm sure he's a good father. Right? They can't make themselves say, this is something the person gets right. I commend to your attention, and you can get it on YouTube, the Nixon-Kennedy debates in 1960. If you know the Nixon-Kennedy debates, you're thinking of them as the famous example of Nixon didn't shave and Kennedy did, and the people who listened on the radio thought that Nixon won, and the people who watched it on television thought that Kennedy won. And of course, that's the part of the lesson of the Nixon-Kennedy debates. But the other piece that's fascinating is they're actually very respectful to each other. Senator Kennedy has got that one right. I think he's correct about that. Vice President Nixon has made a very important point in this. I mean, today, there are stabs in the spin room would say, what are you doing? You can't do that. Right? We've lost something very important when we've lost the ability to start difficult conversations with a search for common ground. My mentor in law school was a man named Charles Black. Charles Black was one of the giants of the judicial activist movement. He was part of the team who worked with Thurgood Marshall and Brown against Board of Education and was one of the intellectual architects of the desegregation strategy that ultimately was successful in taking us as far as Brown against Board of Education and related cases. His intellectual adversary at the Yale Law School was a man named Alexander Bickel. You might know Bickel from his book, Least Dangerous Branch, or you actually know more about Bickel than you may think you do, because Bickel was the one who argued the Pentagon Papers case. The law firm that would represent the New York Times decided not to represent the Times in the Pentagon Papers case, but Bickel would take the case on. Bickel believed in judicial pacifism, what he called the passive virtues of the courts. And so Black and Bickel argued fiercely in print, in debates. When Bickel died, far too young, of an awful debilitating disease, Black wrote a very touching memorial essay in the Yale Law Journal in which he said, Bickel and I agreed on everything except for our opinions. Bickel and I agreed on everything except for our opinions. Even now, even with an issue like Israel-Gaza, yes, especially now. I don't just believe this, I've seen it. Last spring, I was invited to do a multi-day free speech residency, it was called, at Skidmore College. I did the things you'd expect. I did a talk like this to the community. I did a talk to the faculty. I did a talk to the president's cabinet. I met with student government leaders. And then they wanted me to meet with Jewish student leaders and Muslim student leaders. And I said, only if I can meet with them together. I mean, what would it mean to say, we believe in dialogue, of course, difference, but of course I'm only going to meet with the Jewish kids over here and the Muslim kids over here. Right? Totally antithetical to what we're trying to accomplish. Want to meet with them together. It's the first time they'd met as a group since October 7th. I don't know if they ever met as a group before that, but they certainly had not met since then when there might have been a need, would have been a need, was a need. This is Skidmore College. These are lovely, lovely people. And I could see about 20 minutes into the discussion that everybody was being very pleasant and everybody was being very respectful, and we were getting no place. So I finally decided that we had to turn the cards face up on the table. And I said, let me share two of my stories, and let's see if that gets us somewhere. These are two stories that I own. I got to tell you in advance, I may get emotional telling these stories, but there we go. One is a story you probably know, you just don't know that my connection with it. Why would you? One of my colleagues from Brandeis, the head of our Israel Studies Center, who during my years working with him was desperate to go back to Israel, and I needed him to run the Israel Studies Center. Finally, he went back. We found somebody to replace him, and he went back and he lived there. This is the man whose daughter and son-in-law were murdered on October 7th, throwing themselves over the body of their child. You probably heard this story when it happened. This is my friend's grandson. So he lost his daughter and his son-in-law, and he is raising his grandson because of what happened on October 7th. Okay, that's one of my stories. Here's another of my stories. One of my Brandeis students grew up in Gaza, wrote a beautiful memoir of growing up in Gaza for many people. It was sort of their first understanding of Gaza, not as a conflict, but as a region, as a place where people live and grow and send their kids to school and have hopes and dreams and fall in love and fall out of love and all the things that human beings do. He's moved to Washington, where he now lives. You can only imagine the survivor guilt he's got, because not all of his family left Gaza. Much of his family is still there. Much of his family is no longer with us. These are both my stories. I own both of these stories. I care about both of these people and the people that they're connected to. I'll give you a little hint. The legal training afterwards comes in handy because you learn at certain moments the most important thing after a moment like that is to say nothing. And I think there must have been silence in that room for about 45 seconds. That's a lot of silence if you ever sat in a silent room for 45 seconds. And then somebody spoke, and then somebody else spoke, and then somebody else spoke. And look, this is not the point when I'm going to tell you, and they all decided, they all agreed, and they threw their arms around each other and sang Kumbaya. That's not how the meeting ended. They disagreed deeply about the events taking place in that region. But they were talking with each other. They were engaging with each other. And the president of Skidmore tells me the group has continued to meet, his words, in a constructive, not an antagonistic way. That's what the search for common ground can let us do. And that's what our campuses can do. If we have lost the ability to say to the other that I agree with you on everything except for our opinions, then we have lost something very precious. But if we can regain that ability, then, well, you know what we've done? That's your unified community. That's the community you're trying to build. Not the community that agrees on everything. That would be pointless. That means you haven't had a real discussion. But a community that shares what Black and Bickle meant was that they were engaged in issues they both cared about, and each one thought the other was really wrong. But they shared that level of engagement. That's what our campuses are about. What we're doing here is important, because when I am asked, as I often am by Phi Beta Kappa members or others, why are these things happening on campus today? My stock response is, as opposed to where? They're happening all over the country. We're no different from the rest of the society. We get it more so because our whole raison d'etre is discussion and dialogue and issues. And so not only that, but a big part of our community are people between 18 and 23 or 24 when your passions are pretty strong, and sometimes your passions sort of outrun your information. That wasn't meant critically, that was meant descriptively. We've all been there, and I'm proud of it. If we can get this right on campus, then we can be a model for the society. That's not a small thing. That may be the whole thing. That may be the whole thing. Thank you.
Fred, thank you for those amazing remarks. That was inspirational. We're going to invite folks to come up to the mics as you think of questions for Fred, but I'm going to kick us off here, and I'd like to pick up on this Skidmore College experience. And I'm presuming, I'm inferring, just from the context how you described it, it was a smallish group. And so my question, because we've had small pilots like that, I've had an experience with a small number of faculty where we discussed across a divide. We've had experiences with student groups in small numbers. How do we scale?
How do you scale it up? Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think in part you scale it up by doing lots of those, but also in part, what happens on those campuses tends to mean that you are scaling it up. I mean, one of the interesting things is that not every school, as you well know here, not every school had the problems that a group of schools that we've really focused on across the country had. Part of that is good fortune, but I don't think fortune's the only thing it's about. So the campuses in which ultimately things were resolved in a peaceful, non-confrontational way, and let's be clear here. Confrontation needn't be a bad thing. Confrontation is if you and I really disagree on this, we're gonna duke it out. That's not confrontation, right? That's dialogue. Confrontation is when we don't like each other when we're having that discussion. So the campuses where that has taken place, where it's been successful that way, I think you can usually trace it back to months and sometimes years of discussion and dialogue. I mean, again, I don't want to embarrass your president, but I'm sure she will resonate with this. If at the time that the ship hits the sand, and not if, but when, if you're then going around and saying, "Hi, I'm Fred Lawrence. I'm sorry we haven't had a chance to meet yet. I'm the president of the university," you are dead. This is the moment when you have to be able to say to student groups, you have to be able to say to faculty groups with whom you've met, I need you to do me a solid here. And I know that there were campuses when on October 8th or October 9th, there were meetings taking place where people said, I can see where this is going to spin out and I'm going to need your help. So that's how you scale up, by having people involved on that level when it's easy. This is lovely, right? This is a lovely room and we're all nice people and we're all having this conversation. This is when you want to get these things worked out, because at the moment when it's really being tested, it's not nice and it doesn't feel good. And you have to, at that point, say as a community, we talked about this. We have rules here. And that's where your scaling up comes, I think.
Great, thank you. We've got somebody with a question here.
William 77.
Yeah. Fred, thank you for that wonderful discussion and talk. My question is, you've had a long history of giving a variety of talks in your professional career. Have you had any experiences where protesters had interrupted or aborted the talks that you've given?
It's a great question, and I don't mind telling you I've been following not only Brown over the past year, but over the past 48 hours, and I sort of wondered whether this might be the first. The answer is no. I've had I would say questions that were sort of pointed. I have questions that were disrespectful. People who were questioning the whole, ad hominem stuff, that kind of thing. But no, I've never had somebody actually try to shut down one of my talks. And I mean, in memory of my grandmother, I should be throwing salt over my shoulder right now, right? Because who knows what's going to happen next time. But I think there are campuses where that happens, campuses where that doesn't. But Marty, I think a big piece of this you know, in my personal life, I have a lot of connections within the Israel-Gaza world. And so I hear from people with very, very strongly held opinions. And how can you defend students' rights to say this, 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 and this? And of course, the answer to this is if you think they're really wrong, then we have a model for that in higher education. But you don't punish lack of information, you educate it, you teach it. That's what colleges can do. And you can have town hall meetings and you know, have your subject matter experts teaching and the like. So if you do all of those things, the likelihood of having an event shut down is smaller, but it's not zero. So, but I'll remember this question and I'll keep you posted. You may get an email, you know, 3 o'clock in the morning someplace say it just happened.
Fred, I have another question
Sure.
for you. So something I heard you say in a different context spoke to the 4 core freedoms of the university.
Right.
And of course, one of them has been challenged in the Supreme Court, and we live in a different universe now with regard to admissions. But could you kind of share with the audience what are the 4 core freedoms of the university?
Yeah, this goes back to a decision that was that started life as a concurring opinion by Justice Felix Frankfurter. I mentioned his name because Frankfurter was one of those justices who came straight to the court from the academy. He was a professor at Harvard Law School and went straight on the court. And I think that's not an accident. He and Justice William O. Douglas, who was at Yale Law School and went to the court a couple of steps in between. He was head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, wrote a celebrated opinion in a different case where they referred to teachers as the priests of democracy. So, you know, it sounds a little highfalutin, but actually there's something very powerful there if you want to explicate what that term means, democracy as a faith that we need people who minister to. I think that's what Frankfurter was saying. So Frankfurter in this case, that the court decided on very narrow grounds involving a professor who'd gotten his class notes subpoenaed by the Attorney General of New Hampshire. Frankfurter wrote an opinion on the 4 essential freedoms of the university, and the 4 essential freedoms of the university is the right to decide on academic grounds who goes here, who teaches here, what they teach, and how they teach it. This is the reason, as you're referring to the race-conscious admissions case, that the brief that Phi Beta Kappa joined was not on the merits of race-conscious admissions. Many people in Phi Beta Kappa think that's the right way to do admissions. I dare say of my 600,000 members, many think it's not the right way to do admissions decisions. But the big argument in the brief that we joined was one that at the end of the day, this is not a governmental decision. This is an academic decision for a community on academic grounds to decide who goes here and on what basis do we decide who comprises that. So the good news, bad news, right? Glass half full, half empty kind of story. Is that there are justices of the court right now who've taken the opportunity in a number of different cases to say the way in which the Constitution has been interpreted on this issue does not exist in the document itself, wasn't known in 1791. 1791, Immanuel Kant had written a little bit on academic freedom, but what we think of as academic freedom doctrine that we got from the German Research University hadn't started yet. So there were those of us who were reading that race-conscious admissions case, not just about admissions policy, but to see whether someone like Clarence Thomas wrote a separate opinion saying, by the way, the First Amendment doesn't say boo about academic freedom, and therefore we should write that out. So it takes a long time to read a 100-page opinion holding your breath, but I did, and got to the end, and he didn't say that. So that's the glass half full piece of it. The glass half empty is that the court's decision, as Chief Justice Roberts said, is that the academics have their mission, we have ours, and ours is interpreting the Constitution. And to him, the Constitution meant that race-conscious admissions was illegal and unconstitutional, and that's where the loggerheads came.
Fair enough. Other questions? I'm going to keep going if others don't stand up. Amanda, please.
So thank you for that wonderful talk. Is this on?
Yes.
Yep.
So I wanted to ask a question about, first of all, the concept of threat, and also, I mean, and how that's understood, and also this first rule. So I think really in the Israel-Gaza situation, one of the sort of most fraught elements was that the statement of a position was seen as inherently a threat.
Right.
And that was not something that it seemed could be adjudicated. In other words, to give an example, a critique of Israeli policy was seen as anti-Semitic, and therefore a threat of some sort by the person listening. So there's like there's kind of complex psychology, right? And then disagree without delegitimizing, again, that would be at play there too, because it would be seen that a certain position delegitimized in some way the interlocutor, right? Using the same example. So I'm just curious if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I'll get you started on it. It will not surprise you that this is not the point when I give you the magic answer that makes all these line up, right? I always think of, as a legal scholar, we tend not, well, some of my colleagues do empirical work, but those of us who don't do empirical work don't have the experience that my empirical colleagues do of, when you come up with the right equation to explain the data, in fact, not every point is on the curve. Right, but most of them are, and it tends to be the best explanation, and sometimes that's the best we can do. So this is, I think, is part of the best explanation. It is, and I was saying the same thing 10 years ago as I'm saying now. I experienced people 10 years ago thinking I sounded awfully conservative. I'm now experiencing people who think I sound awfully left-wing on these things. To me, it's just me and Louis Brandeis doing our thing, right? I'm seeing it. The issues the same way, and that is that although it is tempting, it is very dangerous to limit the expression of the actor based on how it's received by the recipient. That it is terribly important that we focus on the state of mind of the actor. That is not always easy to do, but it is, at least as I say, the right question to ask. Sometimes the easiest way to start into these problems is to take sort of a paradigmatic case where it sort of illustrates the point, and then to come back into the harder cases. So here's the paradigm case. If somebody's driving down the street a little too fast, but not terribly under the circumstances, but a little too fast, and somebody runs out in the street and they hit them and, God forbid, kill them, and the family of the person who got killed genuinely believes it was intentional, fully believes that there's nothing you can say that dissuades them. Those people, from a victimological pattern, from a psychological pattern, will exhibit all of the hurts and the harms of the family of a murder victim. To them, there has been a murder. But a civilized society wouldn't punish the actor for murder, even though the person has caused the harm of murder, because I've separated the intent from the act, or to use a technical legal language, the mens rea from the actus reus. How does that help us here? Let's take the example that got a lot of discussion, from the river to the sea. What do people mean when they say from the river to the sea? I don't doubt that there were some people who did mean from the river to the sea that a Jewish state has no business existing, and what happens to the Jewish people in the state of Israel today who live there. They don't care, and they don't care if harm is done to them. And if that's really what you think, and that's really what you're saying, that begins to raise some pretty serious questions about the first factor and whether you in fact have stepped over certain lines. I don't think, and this is an empirical assertion that I can't back up as I'm sitting here, but from what I've read and certainly the people I've spoken to, I don't think that even remotely describes the majority of people who use that expression. Right? The majority of the people meant some version of the Palestinian people have been getting a raw deal since the, pick your number, 1948, 1967, 1982, or since October 6th. And if that's really what that's about, the fact that it's received as a threat can't be the relevant factor. The reason I've sort of felt comfortable moving out of the area of hate crime law generally into the area of campus is that, as I tell my students, when I was their age, I used to think I could solve the whole world. I don't think that anymore, but I like to think I can solve maybe little bits of it, or at least make a little progress different places. So on campus, I think it's almost always an educative opportunity. Almost always, right? There's some times where there is some threatening behavior. Cornell, the student, with a gun who threatens the life of another student. We don't know exactly what happened in Michigan, but a Jewish student got beaten up a couple of days ago. We have to know a little bit more before we start opining about what happened there. But let's assume for the moment that it was a group of students, may not have been, who picked him out because he was Jewish and did physical violence to him. Yeah, I think that's not protected expression, to be sure, and that's the kind of thing that you might want to reach to sanctions for. Maybe even throw them out of the university. But again, you don't start with that, and that doesn't describe the vast majority of our situations.
Follow up to that, which
Please.
is when you look at a lot of the sort of very evolving, maybe this is too in the weeds, but the Office of Civil Rights discussion on Title VI,
Mm-hmm.
it seems to be heading into something very different than what you're saying, which is it's not about intent, it's all about how things are perceived and felt, and that the obligations of universities are to prevent hostile environments, which is very much in the eye of the recipient of the speech, not the. So if you could comment on that.
You're right. I think this is a lot of the direction that Title VI is going. The first thing I'll just say as a quick aside, but it's actually not an aside, and it actually maps onto a lot of what we've been talking about. One of the most dangerous things from those of us in the higher education and the law field is to watch how, as administrations change, you get these wild swings in Title IX and in Title VI. And that means, first of all, for your on-campus student affairs people, their heads are spinning trying to enforce these. And most of these are good people who say, what is it you want me to do? And your legal officers are saying, we're just trying to keep up as best we can. But for right now, there is more of a focusing on the effect than the intent. And I've written on this. I think I understand where it's coming from. I think it's wrong-headed, and I think it's the right problem and the wrong solution. Okay? This goes back to the moral obligation to speak. My sense that free speech generates certain harms in a society. There are certain things I know when I talk about free speech. There are things I'm going to hear that I don't want to hear. Things you're going to hear you don't want to hear. Some of them might be very upsetting. Some of them might be very disturbing to you. That's the standard line that we say. Free speech exacts a cost in society, but it's a cost that is worth. That's the price of living in a free society. Yeah, there's a problem in that little aphorism, and that is that cost is not equally spread among all members of society. There are some people in the society, there's some people on this campus who bear more than their fair share of the cost of that kind of speech. That still doesn't get us as far as what the remedy is. The remedy is for people on campus to speak out. The remedy is for the president of the University of Florida to say to the students of color on that campus, yes, he is going to come here, and yes, this is hurtful for you, and I want you to know where I stand on this. I stand with you. I validate your concerns. I'm not telling you you're wrong to feel this, but I'm going to be backing you up on this. So I think the answer to a lot of this Title VI concern, and based on effect, is that it's the right problem to identify. Students who feel they're being stigmatized, people who feel that they're not safe in that sense. It's the right problem to identify, but the idea of inhibiting the expression of the people who are causing that result is the wrong solution.
Fred, thank you. I realize we're a little running over time a bit, so I wonder if the questions might wait for a one-on-one with Fred over the reception.
I'm not going anywhere, and as you probably gather,
I was going to say,
love talking
we
about
have
this
a
stuff,
lovely
so
spread of food. We like to invite everyone to hang around, have continued conversation with Fred, but please first join me in thanking Fred for a marvelous discussion.
Great.